On the freezing morning of November 17th in Bridgestone, a 27-year-old black lawyer stepped into the courtroom with a heart ablaze with justice, ready to expose two brutal cops and a corrupt judge who had concealed dozens of blood-soaked abuse cases. But would she survive the storm of vengeance from the very system she dared to challenge? The November wind whipped through the marble streets of Bridgestone like cold, thin blades. A thick mist shrouded the facade of the city court, turning it into a dull gray block, silent and unfeeling, standing still as though it were observing the souls that walked through its doors seeking justice. On the old stone steps, Amara Bailey stood still, her hands trembling not just from the biting cold, but from the invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. At just 27 years old, less than 2 years out of Harvard Law School, she had taken on a mission that even seasoned lawyers steered clear of, to confront a corrupt police system centered around two officers whispered about with fear in the community, the Iron Twins. Despite the heaviness in her eyes from sleepless nights, Amara's gaze burned with an unusual resolve. She wasn't here to defend, she was here to fight. Her hand gripped the worn leather briefcase tightly. Inside it lay hundreds of pages of documents, testimonies, and photographs, fragmented pieces of a truth that, if pieced together correctly, could force the powerful officers into the glaring light of justice. The court's gates creaked open, and a gust of cold air swept out like an unspoken warning. Amara stepped inside, her heels echoing hollowly in the vast marble lobby. A few glances from security personnel and other lawyers passed over her, some condescending, others full of pity. But what they didn't know was this. Amara's heart didn't beat out of fear, but for the rising wave within her, a heart burning with justice, fueled by the pain she had witnessed, by the fragmented stories from mothers, children, and men who had been beaten and silenced. Every step toward the courtroom was a step through doubt, through the muffled laughter of the powerful, but she didn't falter. Because there was something in the cold morning light, something she could feel clearly. Today could be the day everything changed. Outside the court, a group had gathered. They held signs high. Justice for East End. We believe her. No more silence. An elderly black woman wearing a worn-out wool coat stood quietly among them, her gaze following Amara as she entered, as if willing to share a piece of her strength. Amara met her gaze and nodded slightly. No words were exchanged, but the trust conveyed spoke louder than any testimony. In that moment, she no longer felt alone. Behind her was a community, a pain that had built up for too long, and a fragile hope that someone, maybe her, would rise and say, "Enough. It's time." As Amara stepped through the door of courtroom 3C, the smell of aged wood and tattered files greeted her like a ritual. On the high podium, Judge Leonard Easton's empty chair silently awaited, like a villain preparing for his next act. She took a deep breath, her hands still gripping the case. Inside were the photographs she had spent countless nights searching for, the testimonies of victims who were on the brink of giving up, and the video a 15-year-old boy had secretly filmed from under his torn hoodie. She knew that a small slip-up was all it would take for the other side to deny everything. But she also knew that what she carried wasn't just evidence. It was a response to a system that had remained silent for far too long. None in the courtroom knew that today, this young woman was not just here to testify. She was here to plant the seed of an earthquake. And they also didn't know the truth they were desperately trying to bury was about to knock on their door, unforgiving. Amara sat on the cold, hard wooden bench in the front row on the plaintiff's side, her hands resting on the table, slightly trembling from the tense silence that enveloped the courtroom. Across from her, in a space that seemed to stretch endlessly, were two figures who were all too familiar. Caleb Burns and Derek Shaw, the two police officers known by the chilling name the Iron Twins. They sat with their backs straight, their uniforms crisp, their expressions indifferent to the point of being provocative. Behind them stood a group of other officers, some of whom smirked as if they already knew the outcome of this hearing. And they were right. Amara knew that what she was facing wasn't just two cops, but a system built to protect them at all costs. At the center of that power stood Judge Leonard Easton, a man who had sat on the bench for more than 2 decades, earning a reputation as cold as ice, hard as steel. In the community, his name was synonymous with disappointment. Lawsuits against the police often ended with a soft tap of the gavel and a defense as sharp as chilled steel. Amara had read dozens of transcripts from past trials, fragmented testimonies, evidence dismissed for lack of credibility, witnesses humiliated in public. In this place, justice had no voice, only the laws dictated by those in power. But despite it all, within Amara burned an unquenchable fire. That fire blazed the strongest when she recalled the video she had watched 2 weeks ago, a shaky, grainy recording filmed with a cracked phone. The images on the screen nearly made her vomit. A black man being dragged across the concrete, his face smeared with blood, his hands cuffed behind his back, yet still being beaten mercilessly. A blow to the back of his neck, a kick to his spine, followed by a strangled cry. "I'm not resisting. I didn't do anything." The voice, broken, pleading, desperate, still echoed in her mind like an unhealed scar. It wasn't just a video, it was the reason. She remembered sitting in the small room at the community center, surrounded by piles of disorganized files and the dim yellow light that strained her eyes. Her heart hammered in her chest as she replayed the clip, watching Caleb Burns kick the man in the ribs, his eyes filled with hatred. In that moment, she was no longer a prestigious law school graduate. She became an unwilling witness to a crime. And then she asked herself, how many had witnessed this but remained silent out of fear? How many had tried to stand up, only to be silenced by the cover-up and ridicule? Amara knew exactly what she was about to do was nearly an impossible mission. A young, unknown lawyer standing alone against 2 seasoned officers, a biased judge, and a fractured legal system held together by the hidden power dynamics beneath the surface. But inside her was something they didn't have: the memory of the truth, the memory of the pain of a forgotten community, and the belief that sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up for the wheels of justice to begin to turn, even if it's slow, even if it's filled with blood and tears. She raised her head, her gaze locking onto Judge Easton as he entered the courtroom in his black robe of authority. He glanced at her, a cold, almost contemptuous look, but Amara didn't flinch. She stared him down, and in that moment, something shifted, not in him, but in her. The fear retreated, the trembling stopped. Instead, there was a feeling of steadiness, a resolve etched deep like a knife cutting into stone. No matter how impossible this mission seemed, today she would begin rewriting the story that those in power never thought anyone would dare tell. Amara sat motionless on the plaintiff's bench, her hands neatly placed on the table, but every muscle in her body seemed to tense in time with a low, brewing storm inside her. She didn't have to turn around to know the eyes from behind her were focused on her back, not with concern, but with threats, warnings, and rage buried deep beneath the surface. Behind the victim's row, the police uniforms occupied an entire section, cold and silent like an iron wall. None of them made a sound, but it was the silence that made the air thick, suffocating. One officer sat closest to her, arms crossed in front of his chest, his gaze piercing through the back of Amara's neck like a drill. Another officer gave a slight shake of his head, followed by a smirk, as he saw her pull out the documents, as if to say, "Let's see how long you last after today." Amara clenched her hands in her lap, but her face remained calm. She couldn't afford to waver. Not here, she thought. Not in front of those who were waiting for panic to flicker on her face like an appetizer to their revenge feast. She remembered the words of Reverend Elijah Brooks from the hallway before the trial. They don't need to win by the law. They win by making you doubt yourself. And clearly, they were beginning to do just that. A few court staff members who normally greeted her with polite nods now avoided her gaze. Something had spread from behind the scenes, an unspoken message that she was disrupting the order, that she was the thorn that needed to be removed before it took root. Judge Leonard Easton, still perched high on the bench, had his hands folded in front of him as he watched. No gestures, no clear expressions, but Amara knew he was conducting the atmosphere like an invisible conductor. She caught his glance flicking over the row of officers and then back to her, subtle, swift, but enough for her to recognize there was a silent agreement between him and them. This was no longer just a trial. It was a stage for power, and she, the uninvited guest, had just interrupted the performance. In the bag under the table, the video lay still, the clip showing a black man being mercilessly beaten by the very 2 officers sitting only a few meters away from her. She had watched it dozens of times, rewinding it over and over until each frame was burned into her mind. She knew that if the video were to be shown on the screen, some in the room would be horrified, some would look away, and others would rise to deny its authenticity by any means necessary. But what chilled her the most was the high likelihood that the judge would not allow that video to be shown. A cold breeze from the air conditioner swept across her neck. Or was it the feeling of those eyes behind her? She couldn't tell anymore. But she could feel one thing clearly. The first storm had begun, not with screams or blows, but with glances, with silence as thick as concrete, and with threats spoken in a language only those who had lived in the shadows of power could understand. But Amara wasn't here to endure the storm. She was here to step right into the eye of it, and, if necessary, make it explode from the inside. The air in the courtroom was thick, as if every molecule was straining, anticipating something about to explode. On the large screen to the right of the judge's bench, the opening image of the blurry video appeared, the trembling phone capturing the events of that fateful night. The streetlights flickered across the concrete. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the speakers, causing a few people in the room to jump. Amara stood next to the screen, remote control in hand, her eyes fixed on the display. The clip became clearer. The black man was dragged across the ground, his hands cuffed, blood seeping from his temple. One of the officers, clearly Derek Shaw, kicked the victim in the back while Caleb Burns held the man's head down against the sidewalk. The desperate pleas were drowned out by the pounding of boots against flesh. A loud murmur rose from the gallery. An elderly woman clasped her hands over her mouth. A young black girl started sobbing quietly. But on the other side of the room, the Iron Twins, Burns and Shaw, remained still, arms crossed, faces expressionless. Their calmness wasn't indifference. It radiated something far more dangerous, the confidence of those who know they are protected. No fear, no caution, just another morning waiting for the other side's case to crumble. Amara took a deep breath and moved to the podium, where she was about to present her argument regarding the video just shown. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and firm but not rushed. This video was provided by an anonymous witness, capturing the entire event that took place on the night of October 3rd at the corner of Maple and 17th. We have verified this footage by extracting the timestamp from the device, cross-referencing it with local security surveillance records, and confirming the presence of officers Caleb Burns and Derek Shaw at the scene. The victim, Mr. Malcolm Reeves, was hospitalized with multiple internal injuries. Before she could finish her sentence, the dry voice of the judge interrupted her. "Miss Bailey," Judge Easton cut in. "Can you prove that there has been no tampering with this video? We're talking about visual evidence from an unverified source, a blurry clip that could have been edited. The court requires a clearer basis for authentication than what you've just outlined." Amara stiffened for half a second. She had anticipated this reaction, but the coldness in Judge Easton's voice, as though he didn't see the humanity in the video, made her feel like she was suffocating in this hallowed room. "Your Honor," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "We have the original verification codes from the recording device, as well as location data comparison from the GPS system. I can present the full verification records in." "Don't waste the court's time with technical documents," Easton interrupted for the second time, waving his hand as though swatting a fly. "I haven't seen any clear proof of the identity of the person filming, the timestamp of the event, or even the identities of those in the clip. You say that's Officers Burns and Shaw, but I only see two men in uniform. They could be anyone." A slight chuckle came from the police section, but was quickly suppressed. Amara felt a chill creeping down her spine. The Iron Twins remained seated, silent, unmoved, but their arrogance was clear in every raised eyebrow, every crossed leg. Caleb Burns even leaned back slightly, his eyes leisurely scanning the courtroom as though watching a dull comedy unfold. Meanwhile, Derek Shaw twirled a pen between his fingers, entirely uninterested in the evidence just presented. Both of them knew, no matter how damning the evidence was, as long as they sat there doing nothing and let others deal with it, they would remain untouched. Amara gritted her teeth and then moved to the witness stand. "The court will hear from the first witness," she announced. Reverend Elijah Brooks stepped forward, holding an old, worn Bible. He bowed his head solemnly, his voice shaking slightly as he swore the oath. Then, with a choked yet steady tone, He began recounting the times he had seen Burns and Shaw pull over cars without cause, a young man beaten at the corner of his street, the complaints he had filed that were never responded to. When he reached the detail of having been threatened, the night someone had knocked on his door at midnight and left without a word, a few in the courtroom lowered their heads. Before Amara could speak to reinforce the testimony, Judge Easton spoke again. "Reverend Brooks," he said, his tone as detached as if asking for directions. "Do you have any physical evidence? A report? Surveillance footage? Or anyone else who can corroborate what you've just shared?" Brooks bit his lip. "No, sir, but I—" "Thank you. The court is clear," Easton interrupted, not bothering to hide his frustration. "No independent witness. No physical evidence. What you're saying are just personal feelings, not suitable for legal proceedings." Amara clenched her fists until they turned white. She knew this was no longer a fair trial. It was a control of narrative where the truth held no weight unless it served those sitting at the top. Judge Easton didn't need evidence to dismiss it. He just needed the power to reject it. And the enemy, the Iron Twins, didn't need to defend themselves. They just needed to sit there, smirk, and wait for her to collapse into the quicksand of procedures they had mastered exploiting. The anger within Amara rose like a tidal wave, but she remained silent because she knew this battle would not be won in a day. But each time Judge Easton cut her off, each time the evidence was twisted, it was another warning ringing in her mind. The mountain she was climbing wasn't just steep. There were people sitting at the top ready to throw stones down. The courtroom sank into a heavy silence after Reverend Elijah Brooks's testimony was dismissed by Judge Easton like a dry leaf in the wind. Amara stood motionless at the podium, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. But she did not turn away. She did not bow her head. She did not retreat. Across from her, in the police section, a few people started to chuckle, as if they had just watched a boring play and already knew the ending. Caleb Burns crossed his legs, stretching lazily, while Derek Shaw leaned over and whispered something into their defense lawyer's ear, both of them grinning thinly. From behind her, Amara felt the sting, not from them, but from the eyes of those who had once believed in her, believed in the truth, and now that trust was starting to waver. But then she took a deep breath. The anger surged in her chest like a fire that had been smoldering too long, and she let it lead her, not to destroy, but to ignite. "Your Honor," her voice rang out, slightly trembling at the first words, but then as sharp as a blade. "I object to the dismissal of Reverend Elijah Brooks's testimony. He is not just a storyteller. He represents dozens, if not hundreds, of residents in the East District who have filed complaints with this police department and this court, but no one ever received a response." Judge Easton narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers on the glossy wooden desk. "Miss Bailey," he said slowly, "I've made my stance clear. This is a courtroom, not a stage for emotions." Amara lifted her chin, her voice firming with each word like a hammer striking metal. "Your Honor, justice cannot only be measured by physical evidence when the system is designed to prevent it. There are no security cameras because that area never had funding for surveillance. There are no records because complaints are lost the moment they enter the reception. There are no independent witnesses because those who saw it were either threatened or fired the next day. What do you want from me? A miracle?" She paused for a beat, her eyes glinting with fury, but her voice held steady. "What I bring here is the one thing they can't silence, the testimonies of the living, and I ask that you at least allow them to speak." A murmur spread through the gallery. A few people nodded silently. An elderly man in the front row held his wife's hand tightly. A young girl wiped her tears. Amara could feel the atmosphere shifting from forced silence to a stirring empathy. What she said wasn't just legal reasoning. It carried pain. It carried years of suppressed frustration, and most importantly, the belief that justice had not died. Judge Easton leaned back slightly, his face still unreadable, but his gaze grew colder. He knew, and Amara knew, she had crossed a line that many lawyers would never dare approach. She wasn't just opposing him. She was challenging the entire power structure that ruled here. But what kept him from interrupting, from dismissing her immediately, was the weight in her voice, a voice that no one could confuse with performance, a voice that came from an unyielding heart. She turned back to face her community, the people she had once sat with in cramped apartments, listening to them tell stories in whispers, their eyes clouded with fear. They were here. They were listening. And they were awakening, not because of the system's protection, but because of her presence, the one person who dared to stand alone in this room among those who twisted the truth like snapping a dry branch. Amara knew she would be pushed harder. She knew the storm wouldn't stop. But if today she could do one thing, make those watching begin to doubt that something wrong was happening, then that would be the first crack in the seemingly impenetrable steel shell. And from that small crack, the first light might begin to slip through. After the midday recess, Amara stepped out of the courthouse into the light drizzle of the November afternoon. The air outside was cold and damp, like a whispering warning slipping into the collar of her coat, crawling down her spine. Inside the courtroom, she had just faced a formidable force, Judge Easton and the Iron Twins, along with the chilling indifference of the system. But in one corner of that room, she had felt a flicker of light, a few nods, a few sympathetic glances, a few hearts beating in sync. It was that which helped her walk out of the courthouse on her own 2 feet rather than in collapse. She crossed the marble steps, moving away from the cluster of reporters crowding the main entrance. The heavy coat wasn't enough to shield her from the cold, and her heels became unstable on the slippery, wet stone. Amara pulled her car keys from her handbag as she approached the parking lot behind the courthouse, a secluded area with no cameras, where the old cars of public defenders, legal assistants, and those deemed not that important were often parked. And then she stopped. Her car, the gray sedan, old but loyal for the past 3 years, now stood like a wrecked vessel devastated by the storm. The windshield was shattered like glass, the tiny pieces glinting under the yellow lights of the lot. One side mirror had been ripped off, dangling by a loose wire. On the hood, a scrawled message sprayed in thick red paint, smeared by the rain. "Get back to where you belong." Amara froze for a moment, her breath caught, her hands shaking uncontrollably despite her attempt to stay composed. The silence around her was unnerving. She turned her head, looking around. No one, just the mist drifting slowly on the ground. A soft, distant laugh echoed from the building across the street, causing her to spin instinctively. There was no one, but she knew someone had been watching, and they wanted her to know she was being followed. Beneath the windshield wiper, a piece of paper had been carefully tucked in. She used the tip of her pen to lift it, not daring to touch it directly. The handwritten message was messy but clear. "Touch us again. Next time it won't be your car." No signature. Not needed. The message was loud and clear. Amara stood still for several minutes, the umbrella still in her hand but forgotten, unopened. The cold rain poured down on her hair, sliding down her face, mingling with another drop. Whether it was rain or a tear, she couldn't tell. Her heart raced, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. The storm of revenge had officially begun. This was no longer a metaphorical threat, no longer just the glances in the courtroom or the whispers behind her back. This was action. They wanted her to fear. They wanted her to retreat. They wanted her to know that if she continued, everything she held dear, her car, her reputation, even her life, could be shattered. But along with the fear, something else rose within her, strong, overwhelming, suffocating, determination. Because if they had to resort to this, it meant her words, her evidence, the testimonies that had been dismissed, had touched something they were desperately trying to hide. They were afraid, and their fear became her driving force. Amara pulled out her phone, her hand still trembling, and dialed the police to report the vandalism. But deep down, she knew no one would be arrested. No one would leave a trace. No cameras. This wasn't a crime to be prosecuted. It was a message, not a crime. But she called anyway, as a way to prove to herself she wouldn't back down, she wouldn't be silenced. And when she hung up, looking back at her damaged car, she no longer saw a symbol of fear. She saw a starting point. The storm had hit, and she was still standing here, soaked, cold, but still standing firm. The rain had stopped by the time Amara returned to her small office on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Southbridge area. The sky remained overcast, with streaks of rain still clinging to the windows as though capturing every moment of a day that no one wanted to remember. The yellowish light from the overhead lamp spilled onto her cluttered desk, making everything in the room appear both warm and weary. Her soaked coat was draped over the back of her chair, and her waterlogged shoes sat neatly beneath her desk. She sat quietly, staring at the police report in front of her, indifferent, cold, and useless, like a blank piece of paper. No witnesses found. No security cameras. Not enough evidence to investigate. A clear act of retaliation reduced to another bureaucratic slip, just like so many times before. Amara closed her eyes, her forehead resting lightly against her fingers. Inside her, there was a strange mix of fear, exhaustion, and a smoldering anger that dug deeper with every passing moment. Why did she keep going? Why not just turn away like everyone else? The answer came quickly, because if no one stood up, people like Burns, Shaw, and Judge Easton would continue to crush every hope. Every day she stayed standing was another day the system couldn't be completely silent. But it was still so hard. Too hard. A knock on the door broke the silence. 3 quick, even taps, then nothing. No name called, no footsteps fading away. Amara paused for a moment, then slowly rose. She opened the door to find no one, just a thin white envelope neatly placed on the carpet. No sender's name, no address, no message. She bent down to pick it up, feeling something hard inside the familiar shape of a USB drive. Her heart skipped a beat. She locked the door, walked back to her desk, grabbed her laptop, and plugged the USB into the side of the machine, her heart pounding with anticipation, unsure whether it was from excitement or suspicion. The screen displayed a single folder titled East Internal Files. Inside were a series of PDF files, spreadsheets, and emails with bolded timestamps. She opened one file at random. The header stopped her cold. Contribution from FOP Trust Fund account number 990, PH. She scrolled down, seeing the transfer schedule. 5-figure payments regularly sent each month from an account linked to the Fraternal Order of Police, directed to an anonymous account named Easton Community Development Trust. But what took her breath away was an attached memo, an internal note from the financial assistant in Judge Easton's law office. This should not be exposed. Has been requested to be reclassified as donation for judicial education programs. Be careful if anyone asks. Say this is for scholarship assistance. Amara covered her mouth, feeling like all the air in her lungs had been sucked out. This was no longer speculation. This was evidence, specific, systematic providence. And most importantly, it came from within. The person who had sent this USB was not an outsider. They knew how to cover their tracks, knew where to dig, knew exactly what would tear Judge Easton's mask off. Someone who had been very close to him, someone in the shadows, shifting. She opened another file, an internal email exchange between Easton and an FOP representative. I need to ensure these 2 officers stay out of the media. They did exactly what was asked. In return, I'll handle the lawsuit next week. No beating around the bush. No more doubt. This was blatant collusion between the court and the police, a crack that could no longer be swept under the rug. Amara sat in silence, her eyes still glued to the screen, but her heart now began to beat to a different rhythm, no longer the drum of anxiety, but the echo of opportunity, the first glimmer of light breaking through the thick, gray sky. She exhaled long and deep and felt the warmth of blood rushing back into her fingertips. All her efforts, the interrupted testimonies, the mocking glances, the crushed car, all of it now had meaning because now she had what they never anticipated, the counterstrike. Not just words, but financial evidence, a power structure cracking from within. Sitting alone in the empty room, the light from the screen reflecting in her eyes, the light of hope just sparked. No matter who had sent her that USB, Amara whispered, "Thank you. Not just for this gift, but for reminding her she was not fighting alone." That night, Bridgestone was unusually quiet. The yellow street lights cast a dim glow over the rain-soaked sidewalks, casting shadows on the damaged car Amara had left parked in a hidden corner of the downtown lot. On the 3rd floor of the building where she worked, the lights in her office had not gone out. Amara sat alone in her chair, her gaze empty, staring out at the fogged-up window. The USB lay before her like a powerful whisper of justice, yet her heart was far from calm. The files she had just uncovered could bring down the system protecting Judge Easton, but they could also pull her into a whirlwind of revenge far more brutal than anything she had ever imagined. In the stillness of the room, fear began to creep in, not the vague fear she had felt before her first trial, but a fear that had a clear shape, a shattered car, a threatening message, a shadow at the end of the hallway. possibly anyone. She thought she heard footsteps outside the hallway, a knock at the door that seemed real, the phone ringing once, and then going silent, imaginary sounds that made her heart tighten with every beat. In that moment, she was no longer a strong Harvard lawyer. She was just a young woman standing alone against a machine of violence and power. They will come back, she thought, and next time it may not just be the car. She closed her eyes, trying to suppress the tremor in her chest. And in the darkness behind her closed eyelids, an image suddenly appeared. Her father. He stood in the yard of their old house, his shirt worn and crumpled, carrying a bucket of soapy water to wash the car, his eyes hollowed out from years of labor. Amara had been just a little girl at the time, sitting on the porch eating an ice cream bar, carefree, until she heard the blare of police sirens outside. Then she heard her father's shout, the sound of blows, her mother's terrified screams. She ran out and saw her father pinned to the ground, his face bloodied, his hands still covered in soap suds. "He's resisting arrest," one officer shouted as the neighbor stood frozen behind the fence. But she knew her father wasn't resisting. He was simply asking why they were searching his car. It was the first time Amara understood justice, if unprotected, would be bent into a weapon, and the victims were often those like her father. Now, as all her emotions reached their peak, that memory was no longer pain. It was fuel. Fuel of anger, love, and an unbreakable commitment that she would not let anyone else endure what her father had suffered. He may have forgiven, but she would never forget. And if no one else dared confront that past, she would be the first. Amara opened her eyes. Her gaze was different now. Deeper, fiercer, though still fearful. But this time, the fear didn't stop her. It only proved that the path she had chosen was real. It was dangerous, but it was right. She stood up, pulling the USB from her laptop and slipping it into her coat pocket. In that moment, she knew there was no turning back. What she held now was the detonator, and if she didn't activate it wisely, it would be buried in the hands of her enemies. But just like her father all those years ago, when he looked the police officer in the eye and refused to bow, Amara would not step back. The next morning, Amara sat quietly in a small cafe on the corner of Chestnut Street, a place she often went when she needed peace to think. Outside the window, the city continued its rhythm as though nothing had changed. People heading to work, car horns echoing from the intersection, a homeless man huddled on the sidewalk. But inside her, everything felt different. The USB now sat like a burning chunk of gold in her bag, both evidence and a ticking bomb. She knew the moment she decided to act, she was stepping out of her final safe zone. As she watched the flow of traffic, her phone vibrated lightly. A message appeared from an unknown number. Chestnut Cafe, 9 a.m. I'm sitting at the table in the far corner by the fireplace. Don't call the police. I'm one of the few people standing with you. LH. Amara's heart immediately raced. She looked around, but saw nothing unusual. But her instincts warned her this was either a key to an ally or a trap. She hesitated for a few seconds, then decided to stand and head toward the table mentioned. A man in a brown leather jacket, tall and thin, was sitting with his back to the window, holding a coffee cup, but his eyes were scanning everyone who entered. As she neared, he looked up, and she immediately recognized the contradiction in his eyes. Tired, weary, yet deep inside, something was burning. Amara Bailey, he asked, his voice deep and hoarse. I'm Detective Leo Hahn. I believe you're holding something that Judge Easton doesn't want anyone to see. Amara stood still for a heartbeat, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Who are you? How do I know you're not part of the next trap? Hahn looked her squarely in the eye and leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. I used to believe in the system. I wore the uniform, followed the protocols, and witnessed too many times how justice was distorted right in front of me. And I couldn't do a thing. You think you're alone. But the truth is, not all of us have been corrupted. Some of us in the force, especially me, have been tracking Easton and the Iron Twins for years. But no one had enough evidence to take them down. Until you showed up. Amara furrowed her brow. If you knew, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you report it? You're a cop. Hahn gave a bitter smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because I also knew how the system protects itself. My reports got redirected. Complaints disappeared. My superiors suggested I take some time off after I investigated the wrong people. I was reassigned to internal affairs, supposed to monitor others, but really just a holding pin for officers who were troublesome. But I didn't stop. I kept everything I collected. And now, if you have financial evidence, we can piece the whole picture together. Amara sat in silence, her heart both skeptical and unexpectedly hopeful. The fear of traps, the two-faced individuals, still lingered. But just like the USB from the night before, Han didn't need to show her proof. His existence, right here, at this moment, was evidence enough that the flame of justice hadn't been completely extinguished. She placed her hand on her coat pocket, where the USB lay. If I share what I have, what can you guarantee? Han nodded slowly. Nothing. Except that I'm betting my life on this too. But if we combine forces, I can show you the financial map, the connections between Easton and the police commanders, the internal files that only those within the department have access to. You're holding the spearhead. I've got the map to strike at its heart. A moment of silence passed before Amara nodded slightly. She was still afraid of betrayal, afraid of being hunted, afraid of being buried in the dark. But she also knew, to go far, you need someone by your side. And if Leo Han was real, if he truly despised the corruption as she saw in his eyes, then this could be the turning point she needed. All right, she said, her eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve. Where do we start? Han gave a faint smile. From the place Easton thinks is the safest, the old headquarters of the Fraternal Order of Police. The Monday morning started not with an urgent call, but with a rushed text from an old colleague. Turn on the TV. The news is talking about you. Before Amara could even take a sip of her coffee, the television screen in front of the cafe lit up with an image of her, taken as she left the courthouse, her face tense, hair disheveled from the rain the night before. The local news channel zeroed in on a bold headline. Lawyer Amara Bailey allegedly fabricated evidence and staged witnesses in police trial. Amara froze, her mouth dry. The anchor emphasized every word as if hammering nails into her professional coffin. Sources from within the court have revealed that the video proving police brutality shows signs of being edited. Some witnesses are allegedly financially connected to a community group led by Bailey. Is this a political campaign disguised as a fight for justice? The next image cut to her face, manipulated between footage of injured police officers and chaotic scenes. The setting was crafted meticulously, like a trial without the need for a verdict. Her phone exploded with messages, calls, and malicious comments flooding her old post on a once complimented article about her graduation from Harvard. There were hundreds of comments calling her a traitor in a lawyer's coat, the one burning the system from the inside, the destroyer of societal order. She didn't need to investigate to know who was behind the smear campaign. The police union, with enough money, power, and media influence to turn her from the accuser into the cursed one in just a few hours. The world seemed to flip upside down. The courthouse hallways were now filled with disdainful looks. Those who had once shaken her hand now avoided her. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. The storm of revenge was no longer behind her. It had entered through the door, pulling her into an unending whirlpool. That evening, Amara didn't return to her office. She wandered the empty streets, eventually stopping in front of the small apartment on the fourth floor of an old brick building. The familiar room now felt alien. The yellow light from the bedside lamp no longer seemed warm enough. The wooden floor creaked under her heavy steps. She sat down on the floor, leaning against the bookshelf, resting her arms on her knees. The ticking of the clock filled the quiet room. And then tears welled up, flowing uncontrollably. No more reason, no more slogans, no sharp arguments, just the silent pain, the helplessness of seeing the world suddenly turn its back on her. I should have stopped, she whispered, her throat tight. I shouldn't have gone this far. But then her eyes drifted to the wall on her left, where her Harvard diploma hung in a simple wooden frame. Beneath it, an old family photo, her father in work clothes, her mother holding her as a child, the three of them smiling in their yard. In her father's eyes back then, there was exhaustion but also a quiet pride. She remembered the evenings when he would sit with her, teaching her law, even though he didn't fully understand it, still trying to read through the sections about civil rights and equality before the law. Amara wiped her tears and took a deep breath. She stood up, walked over to the picture, and placed her hand on the cold glass. I won't quit, she said softly but firmly. I've come this far. I won't turn back. And in that moment, The fire that had once burned inside her, a fire dampened by tears and fear, began to flare up again, quietly, but enough to light the darkness surrounding her. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Amara jolted awake to the sound of knocking, not knocking, but pounding, rapid and forceful. She sat up, her heart pounding like a drum. The apartment was enveloped in darkness. She got out of bed, reaching for the small baton hidden under the side table. As she approached the door, she heard a muffled, unfamiliar voice, gruff and indistinct. "You think you're so smart? Open up. We need to talk." Amara's heart threatened to burst. She backed away, ready to call the police, when suddenly her phone lost signal. A loud crash echoed. The door was being kicked. They were trying to break the lock. In her panic, she ran to the kitchen window, cracked it open, preparing to climb out onto the balcony. But just then, a shout rang out in the hallway. "Police! Put your hands down." A sharp whistle followed by the sound of punches, the sound of bodies slamming into the wall. Amara held her breath, backing away, her back pressed against the fridge. The footsteps grew louder in the hall. Then the door creaked open. Detective Leo Hahn stepped in, panting, his jacket torn, blood trickling down his left arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. Behind him, 2 men were pinned down, their faces on the floor, hands bound with zip ties. One of them wore a private security badge. "They were hired to intimidate you," Leo said, his voice tight. "Not thieves. This is a message. Keep going, and the price will be your life." Amara collapsed into a chair, her face pale, sweat soaking her back. But in her eyes, there was no panic, only fire. Leo looked at her, worry etched on his face. "You can stop. I won't blame you. But if you continue, you need to know they won't stop here." She didn't answer right away, but after a moment, her voice came, quiet but steady. "If I stop, someone else will take my place, and they'll be even more alone. I've made my choice, detective." She clenched her fists, and in her heart, though the storm was raging outside, the fire inside still blazed brightly, fierce and unshaken. 1 week after the attempted break-in that almost cost Amara her life, the small meeting room on the 3rd floor of the federal building in downtown Bridgestone became the gathering place for those who no longer believed in silence. Amara sat at the head of the table, her face stern, but her eyes had changed, no longer alone, no longer isolated. Beside her sat Detective Leo Hahn, bandages still wrapped around his arm from that night's intervention. Across from them was Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Cross, a sharp, middle-aged man with a stern gaze, flipping through copies of the files from the USB. Next to him was Special Agent Naomi Rivers of the FBI, her tightly braided hair and gloved hands giving her a sharp, razor-like appearance. But in her eyes, Amara saw respect. "When Hahn sent me these files," Cross began, "I thought it was a joke. But when I read the email from Easton to the FOP that said, 'This won't be a problem if I'm on the bench,' I knew I couldn't ignore it." Naomi nodded. "We've been investigating the FOP for a long time, but there's never been a direct connection to a judge. What you've brought, Amara, is the final piece." Amara looked at them, slightly overwhelmed by the sudden shift. A week ago, she was being called a traitor by the entire city. Now, 2 of the country's most powerful agencies were sitting in front of her, ready to stand for justice. "This is no longer personal," she said slowly, her voice steady. "It's not just because I've been attacked. It's because if we don't act, this system will continue to crush people like my father, forever." In the following hours, the meeting room became the command center. The whiteboard was covered in names, arrows, dates, and times a map exposing the protection racket stretching from the judge's office to the police commanders. Daniel Cross proposed a strategy. "We take this to federal court. This is a federal offense: bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of power. The federal court is not under the control of the state board. Easton won't be able to pull the strings anymore." Naomi added, "The FBI will expand the financial investigation, tracking the transactions between the FOP and personal accounts linked to Easton. We will also protect witnesses if needed." Amara sat still, watching the formation of a campaign she never thought she'd have a chance to touch. The people before her, a federal prosecutor, an FBI agent, an undercover cop, weren't here for her. They were here for what she believed in: real justice. Suddenly, all the loneliness she had felt before evaporated. The fire inside her wasn't just burning, it was spreading. "We'll make Easton face the courtroom," Cross said. "But we need to keep this quiet until the last moment. If he gets a whiff of this, he'll erase the evidence." Amara nodded. "I've lived through fire. Now I'm not afraid of getting burned." Just 3 days into the campaign, bad news hit like a slap to the face. Marcus Green, the key witness who had worked under Easton and held sensitive, unpublished emails, didn't show up for his meeting with the FBI. He had vanished without a trace. His apartment was locked, his phone turned off, and no one knew where he had gone. Naomi immediately ordered a search, but Amara sat frozen. "He was the final link," she whispered to Leo. "If he's silenced, everything could collapse." Leo nodded, squeezing her shoulder. "We'll find him. But right now, you have to stay strong. Everything we've built, this entire city, it's counting on you." Amara turned her face toward the window. The sky outside was darkening like a storm was approaching. But she didn't step back. Not this time. Even if Marcus was gone, even if rumors flared up again, even if the darkness still lurked around every corner, she had come this far. And she knew the storm of revenge was coming closer than ever. But this time, she was no longer alone. Courtroom 4B of the United States Federal Court that morning was eerily silent, as though the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for something monumental to unfold. The gallery was packed with reporters, lawyers, law students, and the public, many of them former victims of the system Judge Easton had once manipulated. Amara sat at the plaintiff's table, her face resolute, her eyes unwavering. Beside her were Detective Leo Hahn, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Cross, and Special Agent Naomi Rivers, a united front against corruption. When the defense lawyers stood to argue, Judge Easton's expression remained cold and arrogant. "My client only received legal support funds from legitimate sources. There is nothing to prove he covered up police misconduct," the lawyer said, but his voice faltered in the face of overwhelming evidence presented by Cross and Naomi: financial records, internal emails, corroborated testimonies. Meanwhile, Caleb Burns and Derek Shaw, the Iron Twins, sat like two cold stones. Caleb gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with fury as they locked on Amara, while Shaw feigned indifference, but his hands trembled visibly. Amara didn't look away. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered since early morning. Banners filled the streets. "Justice for East District. End the silence. Amara, we stand with you." When the evidence was shown publicly on the large screen outside the courthouse, cheers erupted like thunder. Some cried, some screamed in anger, and together they created a massive wave of solidarity that drowned out every defense the accused had. Inside the courtroom, Federal Judge Henry Wallace slammed the gavel to end the arguments. His voice was deep, like the toll of a bell. "The court will now deliberate." The next day, the entire city of Bridgestone seemed to hold its breath. Then, at 10 a.m. on December 23rd, Courtroom 4B was packed again. Even those who couldn't get in crowded the square outside, watching on the big screen. Judge Wallace read the verdict, each word like a nail hammered into history. In light of the overwhelming evidence and testimony, this court sentences Judge Leonard Easton to 20 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy. Officers Caleb Burns and Derek Shaw, convicted for civil rights violations, excessive force, and corruption, shall each serve 18 years without parole. Inside the courtroom, cries of relief and joy erupted. Outside, the crowd roared with tears and applause echoing through the streets. Amara stood motionless, her hands clenched together, until Leo Hahn wrapped his arms around her from behind. Daniel Cross squeezed her shoulder, and Naomi stood beside her, eyes shining. Then Amara collapsed into their embrace, tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from liberation. Tears for all the silent months, for her father, for the victims who could no longer speak, for herself, finally able to fall in the light. Her heart still burned with passion, but now it was no longer alone. It was part of a greater fire, an alliance of truth, courage, and justice. That morning, the sun shining down on the square in front of the Bridgestone courthouse was no longer the harsh light of judgment, but gentle and warm, as if even winter itself was bowing to what had been rewritten here. Amara stood on the familiar steps, the place where she had once walked with trembling hands and a heart encased in fear. But now, Though her eyes were the same, her stance had completely transformed, steady, strong, and shining like the morning sunlight. The people walking by recognized her. Some stopped to shake her hand, others gave her a quiet nod. A young boy ran up to give her a scribbled drawing, an image of Amara standing in front of the courthouse, raising her files of justice high. She laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. Her heart burning with justice was no longer just hers. Now it was a symbol, a spark inspiring anyone who once thought they were too small to stand up to injustice. Leo Hahn, Daniel Cross, and Naomi Rivers were also standing nearby, each with a small smile. But they understood that today wasn't just a day for celebration. Today was a day to remember what had once seemed impossible had finally become reality. In the weeks following the verdict, Bridgestone seemed cleansed. Judge Easton's office was sealed, the FOP underwent a thorough investigation, and a wave of old cases was reopened. The media shifted from criticism to praise, calling Amara the woman who shook the system. But for her, the quiet didn't mean victory. It was a reminder. The storm of revenge might have eased, but other clouds would soon gather. One afternoon, Amara received a handwritten letter from the family of a victim, the mother of the young black man who had been beaten in the first video. In the letter, she explained that after seeing the trial, it was the first time she had felt hope return. "You didn't just fight for my son. You fought for the very heart of this community," she wrote. The letter was placed carefully in a frame on Amara's desk, a lighthouse guiding her through the uncertain days ahead. One evening, as she left the office, Amara paused in front of the glass door, looking at her reflection on the sign that read, "Bailey Justice Fund." She smiled, not because of what had passed, but because of what lay ahead. Her heart still burned with passion, but this time, it had turned into a guiding light, not only for her, but for the souls once buried in silence. The story closes with the image of Amara walking down the steps, her hair flowing gently in the wind, her hands holding new files. The sun was setting behind the tall buildings, but the light had never faded, because justice, though delayed, would always find a way.